I gave a topic that was not printed in the bulletin, and I promptly forgot about it, but I want to focus on that topic. I believe the topic I gave was No King But Jesus. When we're talking about religious liberty, it's very easy for Seventh-day Adventists to turn the discussion into a legal one. You know, what laws we have supporting us. We can talk about the Constitution, good as it is. We can talk about what we're doing to uphold these laws, to question them, to change them. It's very easy to concentrate on our success in dealing with public officials. It's very easy, perhaps even natural for Seventh-day Adventists when we're talking about religious liberty to talk about it in the negative, talk about the time of trouble, which may have already begun, by the way. You know, Ellen White said, it's a direct quote, she says, the plagues of God are already falling. She wrote that in her lifetime. It's very easy to turn religious liberty into all of these directions, which are not wrong, but they may be very wrong if that's our focus. I can't remember what I said when I was here last, but it's likely that I referred to my father's death 7 years ago, and I, on one level, I'm sort of over it, but I'll never forget it. And one thing that stuck with me was after he died, after a couple of weeks in the hospital, and that was traumatic for all of us family members, and I did a lot of retrospection about what my life growing up with my parents and my father had been like. But after he died, in that moment when we left his body at the hospital, we left with a little plastic bag with his clothes on that he'd been wearing when he was admitted. That's a very strange feeling. That's all you take away. And I went home and with my mother to the home that she and my father had been living in. And it was spooky. She remarked on it, and I did too. We were there, but we had the distinct feeling if we just turned the corner into my father's office, he might be there. You always thought that he might call out, that sense of a presence. Not real, of course, it's just our expectation. And I went into his office, and there on the wall was a little plaque that I remembered from the years growing up as a child. I remember seeing it in every office my father ever had, including, of course, the offices at the General Conference where he headed the temperance department. And it's a little plaque, probably on cheap plaster of Paris, but nicely painted, about 4 by 8. And it said this, it says, "One life to live, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." And I've thought about that a lot since. Of course, I've got a personal application on that. But as regards religious liberty, I tried to think about that a lot. You know, we had the Bible reading this morning from Luke chapter 4. That's the very first time that Jesus appeared publicly. He stood up there in Nazareth and read from the prophet Isaiah those words of release, a powerful message of liberation. And I don't believe that it's inappropriate whatsoever to see religious liberty as the message of Jesus Christ to mankind. It's central to the whole gospel proclamation. And as I've thought about that over and over again, and I likely used that text last time I was here, as I've thought about that before, whether it's religious liberty or any other aspect of our church, it has to be done with reference to Jesus Christ. You know, if we're winning a battle in the courts for our accommodation, we've done no victory for Christ at all, made no victory for him. We may not have furthered spirituality one iota. In fact, it may be that if we concentrate on that too much, we'll have set back the cause of God. You know, we had a letter, one of 2 or 3 last year, that troubled us greatly. Not that we're troubled every time we get criticism, because some people like to criticize, but somebody sent a letter in questioning why we had a video that was promoting one of our legislative victories. As I remember the case, I think it was the case of the young people that were out selling books as literature evangelists, and they ran foul of the local authorities, and we invoked a certain law against them, and in the end the local county had to climb down and they were rapped on the knuckles by higher authorities. And this person said, you know, why are we using the power of the law? What sort of victory is that? And they were half right. If that's the central aspect of what we're doing, we've got it all wrong. We're not to go only where the law allows us. We're not to always go with the law as our guardian. We have guardian angels. Angels excelling in strength go where we go. Jesus goes where we go. But I've thought a lot about our service for Christ as it relates to religious liberty. And part of that awareness with me is because I've been studying more and more on our greatest religious liberty figure in early Adventism, Alonzo T. Jones. I don't know if he's known much today. If he is, it's probably by a subsection within Adventism who persist in talking about the 1888 message. And I don't know if you have people in this church, more power to them, but I'm afraid sometimes they have created a misperception about A.T. Jones and about our gospel message itself. Something powerful happened in 1888, but it was not something confined to 1888. It was not something secret. And it was very much something connected to religious liberty. Alonzo T. Jones was a young man mustered out of the military, like many are today. The U.S. Was barely out of the Civil War. It was still a country very much in healing. And Alonzo T. Jones left the military, came under Ellen White's influence, lived in her household for some time, basically became her protege, became a powerful leader in the early Adventist church when there were only, when he began, I think about 15,000 Adventists, and at the time of 1888, 25,000 Adventists. That's a conference at best for all of North America. They were a small company, but they had a sense that God was with them, that this was a prophetic mission that had been given to them. And as I said last night, they were a reform movement within Christianity to point people to the coming of the Creator, the second coming of Christ, to prepare people to meet their Lord. And Alonzo T. Jones became an editor within our system. And as I've looked back on his life, I believe he's the only editor in Adventism that edited the Signs. He edited the Review, and he edited the Religious Liberty Journal. But in 1888, he was editing the Missionary Journal and the Religious Liberty Journal. And something huge happened that year. There was a culmination of a nationwide effort to produce a national Sunday law, which to this day we expect will be the singular marker of the cup of fury being filled up and the end of probation and the last day events. It'll be the singular marker of even this country, a country that has paid very good, well, I was going to say lip service, but a little bit more than lip service, a country that has held itself to a fairly high standard on religious freedom. But with the National Sunday Law, that will end. And A.T. Jones in 1888 saw that it was all coming together. The Sunday law was all but assured of passage through Congress. Senator Blair, its main proponent, the sponsor of the bill, had the backing of all of the major denominations. He had the backing of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other pseudo-religious organizations. And Alonzo T. Jones went on the offensive. He had some help. We were not the only ones troubled by it, but the vast majority of society and of Christian organizations thought it was great to have religious observance enshrined in law. And you can read the legislation online if you hunt for it. I'm sure the key words will bring it up. And it doesn't mince any words. It says that all work under pain of law is to cease on the Lord's Day, Sunday. That's a Sunday law, not a blue law. And as Alonzo T. Jones studied that situation, prayed and thought about it, wrote about it in Liberty magazine, gave testimony before Congress, he became seized by the conviction, first, that they were in the final events, but secondly, that should not happen without a great revival. And so in 1888, when a small church got together for their general conference session, they chose Alonzo T. Jones as the main speaker, spoke every day during the session, and he and his associate editor, J.H. Waggoner, spoke powerfully on the need for revival. You know, they called it righteousness by faith, and people seize on that and read into it, just like I said last night. Religious liberty means many things to many people. No one's against it, but they define it so differently. And to this day, people talk about righteousness by faith, and it can mean anything. You have to talk further to know what the person means. What A.T. Jones meant by it was wholehearted revival and commitment to the cause of Jesus Christ in anticipation of his soon return. And it's not quite true that it was rejected formally, but it's very true, as all such incidents in the past, they were not fully taken advantage of. By definition, if God had been able to move through his people as he'd long wanted, we wouldn't be here. But it was a call to revival. And I don't have, as I usually have, some copies of his different sermons, but you should go back and read them. They can be summarized in what I've shared most, where he says that if you only have this life to deal with, when the test comes, you will fail. Because you have to have died to self and committed your life and hid it with Christ to endure any great test. And we are facing the greatest test. And again, as that plaque in my father's office reminded me, it's only as we dedicate our lives to Christ that our life has meaning. It's only as we're dedicated to Christ that religious liberty has any power. And it's only as we dedicate our efforts as Seventh-day Adventists to upholding Christ before the world that I believe we will have any dignity before a world that has all sorts of arguments. You know, we deal with Bible texts and a few proofs and analogies to the world situation, and that's fine because it's a closed system that reinforces our commitment to Christ. But if we start getting into the higher rationale that the world is capable of, we'll be deceived. Even on religious liberty, there are self-deceptions floating around like crazy. The other day, I heard a leader of the Mormon Church speaking in New York City at the year-end banquet for the Becket Foundation. I don't know if you know of the Becket Foundation. They're a very powerful group that have defended religious liberty in the courts on a number of occasions. Their most recent victory was what is known as the Hosanna Tabor case. It was a woman in a Lutheran church school that was fired because of her health problems, but she said that she was fired because of, she said because of the health problems. They said because she was unfit for service. But it devolved quickly, and the Supreme Court took it up into whether the state could dictate terms to a church on employment. And the Supreme Court reaffirmed in a powerful way that in dealing with church employees and ministers in particular, the church is not to be dictated to by the state. That was done by the Becket Foundation. The Becket Foundation is largely run by Roman Catholic interests and Roman Catholic lawyers. Their current case is challenging the federal government over the healthcare mandate, and that's not nearly as clear as the Hosanna Tabor case. But speaking to that group, this one of the 12 apostles of the Mormon Church got up, gave a powerful talk. People were applauding it all the way. But I noticed he said this. He says there is too much talk of individual rights and individual conscience. There's not enough talk of the rights of religious institutions. I thought, that's very interesting. What's he talking about? And it's obvious as I analyze what he was saying and what was said in the context of his speech, the mainline churches / Roman Catholic, evangelical coalitions and so on, they believe that their corporate mandates in certain situations will take precedence over the rather random conscience invocation of different people who want to claim the rights of religious liberty. The churches are not to be restricted. Very difficult to deal with this sort of a thing. How do we relate the gospel of Jesus Christ in that sort of a situation? Because religious liberty, as administered by certain groups, is anything but the mission of Jesus Christ. As we were sitting here preparing for the sermon, I remembered a hymn that I can hear my father singing it to this day. It's hymn number 578. So send I you. You know, that's directly from the words of Jesus in John chapter 20, I believe it is. We'll just go to John, because I want to read you what he said. John chapter 20, that's where he appeared in the upper room. When the doors were shut, the disciples were still fearful. They were trying to keep out the outside world, but by definition, they were also trying to keep Jesus out. They hadn't realized that with him, they were powerful, that with him they had a reason to be, a reason to speak. And in verse 20, it says he appeared, well, actually in 19, he stood in the midst of them and said, "Peace be unto you." And then he said this, when he had so said, he showed them his hands and his side, reminded them of who he was, in other words, his authority to lead them, that he had done something powerful on their behalf. Then were his disciples glad when they saw the Lord, it says, and then said Jesus to them again, "Peace be unto you, as my Father hath sent me, even so send I you." We're to do a similar work to what Jesus did. And how did he begin it? In Nazareth, by this proclamation of release. I believe if we spoke religious liberty to the world, it wouldn't be the mincing words of a so-called apostle that's discriminating between his organization and its corporate power and the rights of the individual. We would be projecting spiritual power that is available to every follower of Christ because they're delegated by Christ to give the same message, one of release, that we are not under temporal power. I know it seems odd to say so in America, a land that we equate with liberty. We're not against the state, whether it's communism, whether it's capitalism, whether it's a dictatorship. We're not against any of them. We're to live peaceably with any system, but we are to advance and promote the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Christ, the liberation that was done once and for all by the sacrifice of Christ, and the liberation that we are to proclaim to all the people that are in one way or another groaning under the troubles of this world. And I believe once we grasp that, our message, both for religious liberty and our larger message for the church, will take on a different tenor. There was a comment made, I think it was in Sabbath school, about the country that we're living in, post 9/11, how many things have changed. Well, you might not sense it in your personal life, but I'm telling you, the world has changed in shocking ways. And it emanates out from here because 9/11 was centered in New York and concerned most of the United States. But we're living in an era when privacy, when personal autonomy, even religious prerogatives are all being questioned. And we need to proclaim as the answer to all of that, faith and power that comes from Jesus Christ. Let me take you back to that hymn. I read up on the story of it recently, by the way. It was a very young woman sent to the outer reaches of Canada, way up in the Yukon Territory, to teach school there. She was a single lady, and rough frontier town where she really had no friends to speak of. There were no women to socialize with, and she found it very physically tough. In fact, as I remember, she died very young, and all during that time she remained faithful and committed to a Christian calling, and she saw it as a calling to honor her Lord by serving in that far and distant place. And as she read the Bible and the words of Jesus there in John chapter 20, she wrote that poem that became this hymn. She says, "So send I you, by grace made strong, to triumph over hosts of hell, o'er darkness, death, and sin, my name to bear, and in that name to conquer. So send I you, my victory to win." And then second, I'll just read the first three verses. "So send I you to take to souls in bondage." That's John chapter 4 again. "The word of truth that sets the captive free, to break the bonds of sin, to loose death's fetters. So send I you to bring the lost to me. So send I you my strength to know in weakness. You know, none of us are strong enough to deal with what's coming. None of us. I used to imagine that I could sort of tough it out through the time of trouble. I remember very clearly a great aunt of mine in Australia when I went back there and worked for several years in the town of Warburton, little town of 2,000 Adventists, 80 miles out of Melbourne, but it was in an idyllic country environment. I remember my 90-year-old great aunt coming over one day and she had tennis shoes on, you know, the modern variety that I'm already learning are very comfortable to wear when you don't have to wear dress shoes. And she says, I'm ready for the time of trouble. I can run to the hills. Well, you know, what happened one night coming across from her house to ours, she jumped in the dark on a culvert and missed, broke her ankle, and she was never quite the same again until she died at 96. I mean, it didn't kill her, but it was the end of her fence-hopping days and illusions of running to the hills and in her own strength surviving. Cannot be done in our own strength. You know, in Paul's days and the days of the apostles as they went out with that charter from Jesus, they were dealing with the Roman Empire. You know, you think the United States or any modern military and any modern surveillance system is pretty intrusive. It was nothing to what the Romans could and did do. You know, they would use all methods to control people. Remember, the very birth of Jesus took place in the census, where they wanted to number and identify everyone, where they were from, what they were doing. And you ran foul of the Roman authorities. They would make an object lesson of you very quickly. Crucifixion was very common. It was not something extraordinary that was done to Jesus. It was extraordinary that it was done to the Son of God. But it was common practice. The brutal punishment of the state was severe, and as you know from the story, even in our day of Spartacus and the slaves' rebellion, put down vigorously. There was no way the individual could stand against the state. And as the Jewish nation learned with Masada and their rebellion against Rome, you know, anything would be done to destroy you, including basically a mountain built next to your mountain redoubt so that the troops could march up. And of course, they committed suicide rather than be conquered. But Rome was unstoppable. And today it's the same. Don't imagine that we have the power to withstand legally an assault on our liberties if this state, as in any other, gets it in its mind to restrict our practice of religion. There's little we can do in our own power to stop it. The other day I was at an event, well, actually at our Liberty dinner, and one of our leaders said in a moment of exaltation, he says, you know, we're a major player now. Well, I'm glad they think so. You know, we've got a visibility in Washington that I think A.T. Jones would have loved. There's an openness now that we haven't seen for a long, long time, but we're kidding ourselves if we think that we inherently have much influence or control over public policy. That's not the purpose of what we established back in A.T. Jones' day. It was to communicate to them, not to manipulate them. It was a witness to these higher levels of power. God's Spirit is to do the rest. Our job is to communicate and talk religious liberty to these people of influence, these Agrippas, these Felixes, you know, these governors, these senators and congressmen. God will work on their conscience. We need to realize that it's in the power of God we do it. And in verse 3 it says, so send I you my strength to know in weakness, my joy in grief, my perfect peace in pain, to prove my power, my grace, my promised presence. So send I you eternal fruit to gain. I could wish that our church was more Christ-oriented. We've not denied Christ, but I believe we've become the church of logic, and it used to appeal to me. You know, I like to think that logically I can sort of decipher everything, and in reality, none of us are capable of dealing logically with all of the information available. I mean, I swim now and then in the evening on YouTube and other things on the internet, and you can turn your head very easily there. There's so much information, it's impossible for any human to digest it all, let alone to decide what is true and what is false. We don't have that power. And our church persists in encouraging the idea that everything we have is extremely logical. It should be consistent, it should be biblical, it should be a perfect package of understandings that can point us toward heaven. But nobody can know it intimately in every great detail, but what we are called to know is Jesus. We're called to have an intimate connection with Him. I've preached a number of sermons on the different talks that Jesus gave, and there's a prime talk there in Matthew chapter 5, what is known as the Sermon on the Mount. Ellen White wrote a whole book on it calling the Mount of Blessing. Many commentators that I've read say that it's the manifesto of a kingdom. And just as when Jesus stood up to announce his ministry there in Luke chapter 4 in Nazareth, if you read that Sermon on the Mount, and it's much larger than the Beatitudes, but most people just know the Beatitudes, there's something, I think, significant for us when we talk religious liberty. In chapter 5 of Matthew, it says, Jesus, seeing the multitudes, went up onto the mountain. By the way, I've never heard anyone comment on it, but what did this follow on from? Just a few verses before in the previous chapter, Jesus was in the wilderness after his baptism, and the devil came to him with three great temptations. And the last one was he took him up onto a high place and said, I'll give you all of this if you'll swear allegiance to me. And that followed on from where he said, throw yourself down from the high place. And he says, you shan't tempt the Lord your God. But Satan said, I'll give you everything from this high place if you'll just subvert your mission. And of course, Jesus couldn't do that. But then a few verses later, he's on a high place again, giving out, as it said, the principles of his kingdom. And he began with the blesseds or the happies. And it's a good positive way to give a sermon. I don't do it very often. I probably should do it more. We need to uplift people, give them possibility thinking, but not, greeting card theology, as many TV evangelists give, but point people to God and the spiritual possibilities with us. And Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. You know those Beatitudes. And something you may not have noticed, of the 9 Beatitudes, 2 of them relate to religious liberty, and they're actually in the negative. In verse 10, it says, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you, falsely. That's worth remembering. If they say it correctly, we should be ashamed to take the name Jesus Christ. It reminds me, years and years ago, when I was very young, and some might remember it, Pat Paulson ran for president of the United States. A comedian did it as a bit of a joke. And he got up once and he said, he was making a joke of running for president. In fact, he said once, if nominated, I will not run, and if elected, I will not serve. But he then said, rumors of the very worst type are going around, true ones. Well, Jesus doesn't want true rumors to go around us that are a disgrace to our Christian calling. If we're accused falsely, God will stand for us, and we're blessed for that. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice, said Jesus, and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. And we need to recognize that, both within the church and without. The natural inclination of man, an unregenerate person, is to fight against righteousness. And I don't think it's immaterial that in 1888, when A.T. Jones stood up and proclaimed righteousness by faith, he got a lot of kickback. He got kickback from many of the leaders who already were bothered by him, because Ellen White, and I was just reviewing it at the beginning of the service here in this book from the White Estate. Ellen White had backed A.T. Jones over and over again in the disputes with the leadership. He was very opposed to taking state aid. He was very opposed to some of the compromises that were creeping into the church. and often the course that the leaders at the time were trying to take. And Ellen White brought them up short over and over again. And in one of the letters that's actually in here, they said, "You always take E.T. Jones's side. You know, how come it is? This is not fair." So when this young upstart, and he was relatively young, stood up there and was calling for revival, they hardened their hearts and they rejected him largely, at least administratively. And that in large measure was why Ellen White went to my homeland in Australia. She was fed up with them, fed up with a hard-hearted attitude. Not that they had become an apostate church, but they had become spiritually hardened to a message of revival that centered in the religious liberty emergency of the time. And the thing that is clarified in my mind as I've studied what happened at that time with A.T. Jones is it didn't end in 1888. I better get my year right, I think it was 90, well actually I'm not sure whether it's 92 or 93, I think 92. He spoke again at the General Conference session and then also in 95 as I remember. So he was a speaker 3 consecutive General Conferences. But in 1892, the Sunday law had been defeated by then, but the revival had not taken, the revival that he so fervently wished for in Adventism. And in 1892, the federal government of the United States, the U.S. Congress, took a legislative action. It wasn't a bill, but it was I'm trying to think what you would call it, a resolution that in building the Chicago World's Fair, which was the big international event for the emerging power of the United States, that in building that, they resolved that there should be no work done on it on Sunday, and as the resolution said, on the Lord's Day. And Alonzo T. Jones again was convinced that in this action, the United States had fulfilled the role of the third angel in Revelation 14, that it had become an apostate power that was enforcing false religious observance, and therefore it was all about to happen. So when he stood up at this General Conference, the same message. It was a little less spiritual in its general call for Christ. It was more particular in explaining how, as I said earlier, we need to have set aside this life in our allegiance and our spiritual reality and be so committed to the future kingdom of Christ that nothing that this kingdom could do to us would slow us down. That's really what it's all about. Because at the end of the day, like the rich young ruler, if we're touched in our property, if we're touched in our person, it's almost natural for the natural person to fall back, to be intimidated. And the powers that are against us already are powers that could barely be imagined in the Old Testament times. I went to a church recently. Actually, I went there and I spoke in Friday and Sabbath morning, but I ducked off for the afternoon meeting because it was in Florida where my mother was. And I said that I was leaving after the church, but I ended up having lunch with them, and I heard them announcing the afternoon meeting. And I was quite startled to hear that it was all about drones. And you know, I can get as paranoid as anyone, but I didn't think it was quite appropriate to spend a whole afternoon on the drones. And so I asked somebody, I said, you know, why are you so hung up on the drones? And they said, well, there was an article in our newspaper just this week where the sheriff for this county has made application for, I think it was several dozen drones, not just to surveil citizens, but to have them armed against lawbreakers. That's the brave new world that we're on the edge of going into, where the eye in the sky is watching you, and maybe hellfire missiles can come down as they do in Afghanistan and other places. The tools that are given to modern man are amazing. You know, every time you use your telephone, somebody can track you. Every time you drive your car, somebody can track you. Every time you use the computer, somebody can insert themselves into your computer. Use your computer for something else or observe everything you do. There is no hiding place. There is no hiding place. And we need to realize this. The only security we have is with Jesus Christ. And I believe when that catches on with our church at this particular point in history, a revival will come. I was very excited when Pastor Ted Wilson was elected and gave his opening address at the General Conference, because he called for revival. I haven't given up on it yet. I do think we've hardened our hearts as a church, because I don't see a broad-based revival. And we've got to be careful, because Ellen White says, even within our church at the end of time, there will be many that will be exalting that there's a great revival going on, but it's a different spirit in their hearts. A revival within Adventism, a true, godly, Christ-centered revival, will be known by its emphasis on Christ and its concern for the particulars that He's given to us. It won't just be, as Ellen White says, loud drums, lots of noise, lots of emotion, happiness, I'm okay, you're okay. No, a real revival, I believe, will have a lot of tears and trembling and praying and dedication and activity and a wide, broad call going out from our church. I haven't given up on that yet, but it's not happened yet. And instead we see, and don't get me wrong, the argument itself might even be immaterial, but this argument over women's ordination, our church structure is shaking and rocking as our people debate and argue and use nefarious methods on both sides to get their agenda through. It reveals a wrong spirit. We need the Spirit of Christ. In John chapter 7, Jesus, right at the end of his ministry, after his resurrection, sat down with his disciples. And there's a lot of talk about the upper room and the Last Supper. That was an emotional moment that I think would have been heart-rending for Christ and the disciples too, if they'd known what was going on. And I'm positive when I was here last time, I spoke about the Passion of the Christ movie that stirred me, particularly when I first saw it on an advanced screening. And every now and again I go back and look at it, and it's been accused of being gratuitously violent. Well, I think the story was gratuitously violent because Satan showed his hand there. But one thing in that movie that I think they touch on powerfully, because it's interjected with the bloodlust of the Romans and the Jewish Sanhedrin and so on, is the cutaways to the upper room. And there Jesus says, my friends, I've called you friends. And he looks at Judas, about to betray him. He looks at Peter, about to deny him. And I've got young children, and I know that on occasion they can do some pretty amazing stuff. But when I look at them, something happens in my heart. You can't put away your feeling for someone because you know they're about to do something horrible. Jesus suffered through that upper room, but then he died and he rose again and then sat down with those same men. And what did he talk about at the very end? What did he talk about? It was pretty much an enlargement of that statement, as the Father hath sent me, so send I you. But he spoke about oneness. He spoke about these men that have been called out of the world, but not kept from the world. And I don't want to read the whole thing to you. It's all of chapter 17. But he says, glorify your Son. And he says, these are the ones that I've taken out of the world. But he says this in verse 3, and this is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. I have glorified thee on the earth. And now, O Father, glorify thou with me, and I have manifested thy name unto these men. They have known all things whatsoever thou hast given me are of thee. And he says, I pray for them. I pray not for the world, but for them. We have to believe that God has a special place for this church. That what does Ellen White say? The church, enfeebled and defective, is still the object of highest regard for heaven. We need to see that. I want to read you a few lines again from this selection, and I'll tell you, but I hesitated doing this because it'll make a lot of work for us. But this is a fabulous collection. It's not definitive, but it's a little different in some parts than what you'll get anywhere else. It's put out by the White Estate, and it's called Spirit of Prophecy Counsels Relating to Church-State Relationships. For years I've been buying these from the White Estate for about $8. I don't know if they make it available anywhere else. I think not. But this is the form. It's just printed. It's just typed, basically. And recently at Liberty Magazine, we had it reformatted, redesigned, a nice cover with Jesus at the United Nations on the cover, glossy, and printing it in regular typeface. It even got smaller and more compact, but it cost us $5 each to print for our own use, so they're cheaper and nicer looking. And I've been giving them out. And if you contact us, we'll sell you an individual one, and if you want to use them, we'll do a deal with you for larger amounts. But I'd love to get this book out. But I want to read you, I put a tag here, what Ellen White wrote. This was originally in Desire of Ages, page 508. She says, "The kingdom of God comes not with outward show." Remember, we were talking about Jesus on the mountain, where he announced the principles of the kingdom, the manifesto of the kingdom. Judas never got the idea. And some of our leaders, I don't think, have it. I'll tell you this freely because I've made criticisms to them purposely. We have state receptions on occasion with ambassadors and even sometimes heads of state, and I see the leaders get up over and over again and they'll say, we have so many million members, we have so many hospitals, we have so many churches, and at best I think that's like Nehemiah. That doesn't say anything about our spiritual strength. That's not the sort of outward show that really impresses a secular leader much, because however you cut it, we're small on that level. But if we show ourselves to be a vibrant, dynamic, spirit-filled church, that will impress them, I'm sure of it. And so Ellen White says it doesn't come with outward show. The gospel of the grace of God with its spirit of self-abnegation can never be in harmony with the spirit of the world. The two principles are antagonistic. The natural man, she says, quoting from 1 Corinthians 2:14, receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. But today, she says, in the religious world, there are multitudes who, as they believe, are working for the establishment of the kingdom of Christ as an earthly and temporal dominion. Interesting she used that term. Right now, within us, and I haven't seen the term lately, but they've not changed their goals, are Protestant dominionists, aching for control in the United States, because they've latched onto the idea of Adam and Eve created to have dominion over the natural creation, and therefore in this godly nation, people of godly power need to take political control and exercise dominion. And you think that dominion will be allowing of political or religious differences, rather? I think not. And she says they desire to make our Lord the ruler of the kingdoms of this world, the ruler in its courts and camps, its legislative halls, its palaces and marketplaces. You might think that'd be good. But she's saying this wrong group want that. They expect him to rule through legal enactments enforced by human authority. Since Christ is not now here in person, they themselves will undertake to act in his stead, to execute the laws of his kingdom. There's the rub, of course. The establishment of such a kingdom is rather what the Jews desired in the days of Christ. They would have received Jesus had he been willing to establish a temporal dominion, to enforce what they regarded as the laws of God, and to make them the expositors of his will and the agents of his authority. But he said, my kingdom is not of this world. That was from John 18:36. He would not accept the earthly throne. I've got two more paragraphs. And she says, the government under which Jesus lived was corrupt and oppressive. On every hand were crying abuses, extortion, intolerance, and grinding cruelty. Yet the Saviour attempted no civil reforms. He attacked no national abuses, nor condemned the national enemies. He did not interfere with the authority or administration of those in power. He who was our example kept aloof from earthly governments, not because he was indifferent to the woes of men, but because the remedy did not lie in merely human and external measures. To be efficient, The cure must reach men individually and must regenerate the heart. I believe Ellen White has set out clearly here as elsewhere the true dynamic in relating to the state and advancing religious liberty. She says, not by the decisions of courts or councils or legislative assemblies, not by the patronage of worldly great men is the kingdom of Christ established, but by the implanting of Christ's nature in humanity through the work of the Holy Spirit. As many as received him, she says, quoting from John 1, 12 and 13, as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of men, sons of God rather, even to them that believe in his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And then she concludes by saying, here is the only power that can work the uplifting of mankind. And the human agency for the accomplishment of this work is the teaching and practicing of the Word of God. You know, that's sobering. That's a very sobering outline, I believe, of where we are today. This is not ancient Rome as far as those abuses, but as far as the pattern, it's no different. Whether it's ancient Greece, ancient Rome, whether it was the Soviet Union under a communist system, whether it's China or whether it's Saddam Hussein, whether it's the United States. Every earthly system, by definition, is on the wrong track. It does not support the things of the Spirit. At best, it does what Paul said, and he's been most misunderstood. It has taken on under its authority the civil control of interhuman behaviors. It's legitimate in that as long as it acts legitimately. And so in reasonable authority to deal with the interaction, to keep down overt crime and so on, we should support the state. We're never to be the enemy of any state. But when we cross the line and think we're doing the very will of God to uphold the power of that state, we've got it totally wrong. I just believe Christ is against anybody that thinks that way. My kingdom, said Jesus, speaking to Herod, is not of this world. And what did he say? If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would fight for me. We're not called to fight for him. I mean, it happens now and then. It comes to my mind. I read an article recently about chaplains in Afghanistan, and they said one recent religious exercise in Afghanistan, the chaplain gave a pretty rousing a sermon about how they were God's soldiers there to bring righteousness and justice. And so the soldiers raced off from that meeting and they painted on one of their jeeps, Jesus killed Muhammad. And off they went, you know. They got it totally wrong. And you know, we discovered a couple of years ago that a company that were making the gun sights for all the military, they'd stamped in code Bible texts after the serial numbers, and they were texts about, you know, Christian warfare and so on. And it was even said by some of the commanding officers who knew about it that these were holy weapons. You know, there's nothing holy about violence between men, even in the name of God, because it's falsely taken. God is not in such a thing. Deeds of love and mercy, says another hymn. Deeds of love and mercy are the ones that justify our commitment to Christ. Let me read you one more statement from Ellen White as far as we depend in these last days. Last night a lady handed me something from the internet, the sort of thing I'd seen before. And I don't know the future any more than you, except that I extrapolate from God's word and some of the things that Ellen White says. But if you go online, you will not sleep because there's just so much floating around. And you know, this thing said that in a couple of weeks there'll be martial law in the US. I don't know how anyone could know exactly, but it's certain that there's nothing but troubles ahead for the world, let alone the United States. But in Testimonies, Volume 5, which I think is the best testimony collection of all of them, Ellen White wrote this. She says, God has always wrought for his people in their greatest extremity. And we're not really at our extremity yet. Although it's coming, as I think I said before, you know, our colleges are in deep trouble. And I've been warned not to speak about one college, their legal actions there, but I mean, it's all but lost to us. Our publishing houses, which I'd committed my life to when I came back from Australia, I mean, I'd been working in Australia at the publishing house, trying to stop the collapse of one house over another. They're formally decided to do something about it, and we don't know how it'll go, but it won't be two autonomous publishing houses anymore. The Media Centre, a few weeks ago, they decided to disband it. Any way you look at it, the structure is collapsing. And Ellen White says the church will appear about to fall, but it will not fall. And it will not fall because there will be a revival, not because men of great intelligence will have restructured in a way that strengthens the business aspect of the church. It never was the real source of power for the church anyway. So Ellen White says, God has always wrought for his people in their greatest extremity, when there seemed the least hope that ruin could be averted. The designs of the wicked men, the enemies of the church, are subject to his power. We need to know that. And overruling providence. He can move upon the hearts of statesmen, the wrath of the turbulent and disaffected, the haters of God. His truth and his people can be turned aside, even as the rivers of water are turned if he orders it thus. Prayer moves the arm of omnipotence. He who marshals the stars in order in the heavens, whose word controls the waves of the great deep, the same infinite creator will work on behalf of his people if they call upon him in faith. He will restrain the forces of darkness until the warning is given to the world. That's a promise that I want to claim. It's no good if the probation closes now, even if you and I are saved. Because I don't know about Lacey, but I know generally in the United States it's fallow ground for Adventism. They don't know this message. The proclamation hasn't yet been given. So we have to pray that the winds of trouble will be held back. It says he will restrain the forces of darkness until the warning is given to the world, and all who will heed it are prepared for the conflict. We need to have a concern for our fellow men. We're all cut from the same cloth as far as human beings, and it's pretty easy when people reject you to turn like Peter and John and say, bring down the fire on them. They're not fellow travelers, but they are fellow creatures that deserve God's mercy as much, and some of them maybe more than you and I. And as our calling as Seventh-day Adventists, people that believe in liberation that Jesus proclaimed in Nazareth, that believe as part of our church history in religious liberty, we need to see it as this huge message writ large and have it as a burden for mankind, and that we need to do something, say something, make a difference for Christ while we can, because the day comes, as Ellen White warned, like money, if it's a matter of money, and it's not the only thing we can do, but money that is not given to the Lord's cause, she says, will be thrown at the church and it will be worthless. I don't know if this internet warning is valid, but it's likely that at some future, likely close rather than far point, our money will be devalued. We're living in a fool's paradise. I heard a statistic the other day that was rather sobering, even though mathematically it perfectly made sense. But they said the interest on the national debt is quite large. And they said if $1 million was spent every day starting in the time of Christ to the present, it still wouldn't equal just the interest each year on the national debt. The monetary irresponsibility of our modern system here is mind-boggling. And it's not just irresponsibility, it's diminishing of the integrity of the currency. Caesar's currency, remember, not God's. And it only has value as people think well of Caesar. It's called fiat currency. And in one moment, Revelation says, the merchants of the world will lament that this great city, Babylon, and you can relate it more directly to a false religious system, but I believe it's a system of confusion and man's self-confidence. In one moment, this will evaporate you know, I forget the text, but it says, you know, so many large sum of money for a little thing. Things will be devalued. World War II, we saw, I don't remember it, but I read about it, wheelbarrows of money it took to buy an apple. But what does it take to buy spiritual commitment? What does it take to gain a vision of Christ alive in your heart and to feel his power compelling you to proclaim liberation to a world that is shuffling toward Bethlehem to be born, to use that poem that I used to, you know, William Butler Yeats on the Second Coming spoke of an ancestral beast, a satanic elemental force that in a sad alternate reality to Jesus' birth in Bethlehem is going to be born into this grotesquerie that will make a mockery of everything that Jesus came to bring. It's only through the life of his committed saints, I believe, that Jesus is vindicated. Not through how many Liberty magazines we print, not through how many hospitals we have, not through how many schools, but through how many people have a heart burden to proclaim Jesus to the world. And that's my prayer for this morning. And thank you for your attention.